Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our book discussion of Mark Jordan's Convulsing Bodies, Religion and Resistance in Foucault. If this is your first time here at the center, welcome. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the center. And if you've been here once before or many times before, welcome back. It's great to have you tonight in the room. It's a bit crowded. If you come in and see that, actually, if anyone can find the seat, you're welcome to sit on the rug, which was vacuumed recently, so no one should be shy. And we're very happy to be here tonight. The inspiration behind this series is that we as a community, an intellectual community at the university and at the Divinity School, are busy in so many different ways. Our paths cross at meetings, sometimes in the classroom, all kinds of ways our work intersects. And we all know that much of our time, much of our blood, sweat, and tears goes into those hours that we eke out for our research projects, for our writing, for the book projects that sometimes take years to complete. And we realize that very often there are few opportunities to look more deeply into that work and to see what is it that we have done, because the book may be authored by the one person, but it's also a product of the community. We write where we are. And I think our work makes sense in terms of where we are. So the series was started simply on that premise, that it's a way to celebrate the work of scholars in our midst and to explore and open up how that happens. One of the favorite issues that comes up at these sessions is, how did you ever come up with that topic? Why did you write on that? And I think sometimes, in larger terms, why this and why not something else, but how does it work that you come up with a project, an insight, and how does it get carried through? I think we probably all have in our heads book projects that will never get completed, some that never get off the ground at all, but some do, and what is the dynamic of that? And this is really a chance to open this up with Mark Jordan himself, and then I'll introduce him first, but then we also have three wonderful respondents: Mayra, Rivera, Amy Hollywood from our faculty here, and James Bernauer, who's crossed the river from Boston College. So it's a wonderful occasion. I would just say in passing, we have three more book events this semester. On the 26th of March, Jocelyn Cesari's book, The Awakening of Muslim Democracy, Religion, Modernity, and the State. On April 14th, Kevin Madigan's Medieval Christianity, A New History. And then a postponed from one of the snowstorm days, my own book on April 20th, His Hiding Place is Darkness, A Hindu Catholic Theopoetics of Divine Absence. So if you are taken up and enchanted by this event tonight, we do hope that you can come back for events in the future. So our format tonight is fairly simple. I will just say a word of introduction for Mark Jordan, who needs no introduction, of course, but I will introduce him. Then Mark will speak 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever seems appropriate, about the book, how it came to be. And then I'll introduce our three respondents, and they were not assigned to review the book or globally say everything about the book, but to engage it in some way, from some angle. And then after the three respondents or discussants are done, we'll open it up for a general discussion. So Mark Jordan, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Christian Thought, is a pioneer in sexual ethics, a wide-ranging scholar in the history of Christianity, medieval scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, incredible wide range of work, both ancient, classical, and modern. Over the past 2 decades, he has focused in the field of sexual ethics, producing books that are widely regarded to have opened up new avenues of discourse, particularly in regard to homosexuality and the ethical reflection on the meaning of marriage in today's society. Just to mention a few of his many publications: 2001, The Ethics of Sex; 2002, Telling Truths in Church; 2005, Blessing Same-Sex Unions; 2006, Authorizing Marriage, Canon, Tradition, and Critique in the Blessing of Same-Sex Unions; 2011, Recruiting Young Love, How Christians Talk About Homosexuality. Mark, there were a couple of years there when you didn't have a book come out. I must have missed them at Hollis or something like that. And tonight's book is not the end of the road. Mark's website tells us the next book project is entitled Teaching Bodies, Traditions of Moral Formation in Thomas Aquinas. All I would say about the book is, first of all, I've noticed on the web in my deep research that the cover has already been awarded a prize. So when you're thinking of judging a book by its cover, this is a good one to judge by. But I'm convinced that some people came because of the irresistible titles of the chapters. Let me just read a few, and then I'll pass the book around in case anyone has not a chance to see it. First one starts rather tamely: Hunter of the Sacred, The Dismembered Assassin and the Well-Scrubbed Delinquents, The Buffoon King and the Possessed Nuns, Chatting Genitals, that's chapter 4 if you have special interest, The Sobbing Matron and the Loquacious Monk, The Artist of Pleasures, The Violated Mother and the Naked Philosopher. More seriously, I was dipping in just a little while ago into the introduction, and Mark talks about, as I think he'll talk to us about, how one encounters and engages an author as rich as Foucault, and how one kind of finds one way into the material as part of what we're interested tonight. And as he says in the introduction, there are many different ways to read Foucault text, and I don't want to replace them with paraphrase, much less to make a scrapbook in which I copy out passages next to commentary from the quarterlies or pictures clipped from magazines. I record my reading only of some texts, not all that bear the name Foucault, but many of those texts. I do take the text in a certain chronological order, but I also feel free to cross-reference. For my fandom, the objects of liveliest interest are works, not theories or theses. Academic vices being as strong as they are, I repeat in a louder voice, this is not a comprehensive or systematic survey of the development of Michel Foucault's ideas on religion. I wish only to stand in front of a selection of Foucault's texts, pointing here and there in admiration. I want to bring some of his characters back on stage in their garish masks. I want to applaud Foucault among them, the old busker. And on that note, the young busker Mark Jordan will take over.
Young must be an analogical term. Thanks to my three respondents first, each of whom read the manuscript at various stages and each of whom made it better without necessarily being convinced by it. Thanks as well to Frank for the insistent invitation and for not letting me squirm out of it, which I tried to do at least 6 times, according to the email record. And thanks to all of you for venturing out at the slushy end of this snow-smothered winter, and most of all, for the gift of your time. You may remember the delicious opening sentence of the story by Jorge Luis Borges entitled Tlon Ucbar Orbis Tertius. The sentence reads, I owe the discovery of Ucbar to the conjunction of a mirror and an encyclopedia. Ucbar, you may also remember, is a collaborative writing of a fictional world that begins to take over this world. The fiction becomes manifest as things. That's a Foucauldian parable. Less elegantly, less wittily, I could say that I owe the composition of this book to the conjunction of an image and an anniversary. The anniversary came when I realized that I had been reading Foucault for almost 40 years, since I picked up a copy of The Order of Things in English at the Co-op, not the Coop, the Co-op in Austin, Texas. What does it mean, I wondered, to read an author over decades, especially decades during which new works by the author continue to appear? So I wanted to write a book that would register the time of my reading of Foucault, a record of affection for him, but also for the reading life. So my book deliberately and perhaps too obviously marks time. It follows the chronological order of his works, from the History of Madness to the last lectures. It situates his work in relation to other books that he read and loved, books by philosophical or historiographical conversation partners like Nietzsche, Bataille, Certeau, but even more books by admired poets like Charles, or novelists like Blanchot, Klossowski, Gracq, or playwrights like Jarry. Then, more elliptically, the book marks the time of my reading of Foucault in relation to my life and his death. The other juxtaposed element I said was an image. It's the image I put in the book's main title, The Convulsing Body. The image first struck me in Foucault's lectures on abnormals, delivered in the spring of 1974. The lecture series as a whole may be my favorite single piece by Foucault. It is announced as an exploration of the category of abnormality within modern forms of power over life, what Foucault would go on to call biopower. That abstract summary hardly does justice to this series of lecture scripts in which Foucault exerts all his literary charms. He begins, for example, by reading out recent French court decisions that cite psychiatric expertise, including expertise about homosexuality. When his audience begins to laugh, Foucault says, "It's your laughter that is truly interesting." Because there are forms of modern power that have this odd feature. They make us laugh, even as they claim the power to kill us. From the opening pages, then, the reader watches Foucault stage the performance of living bodies reacting to powers that can regulate life, especially by denying it. In the middle of these lectures on abnormals, Foucault turns abruptly, and the abrupt turn is his typical way of approach to Christianity. Foucault turns abruptly from narrating the genesis of modern clinical notions back to the expansion of Christian pastoral practice in the Counter-Reformation. He recalls the demonic possessions of the Ursulines at Loudun, typically known to English speakers from Aldous Huxley's book or Ken Russell's film, but recently recounted to Foucault's audience in a book by Michel de Certeau. Following Certeau, Foucault describes Loudun as a theater of possession. One central character is the spiritual director, who represents the new pastoral power of Counter-Reformation Catholicism. He is triangulated with the devil and the female possessed, usually a nun. Her body is fragmented by warring forces that occupy it from opposite directions. The body, always interpreted by the spiritual director through the Christian category of the flesh, becomes a citadel body, a battle body. Abruptly, it convulses. Convulsions are the plastic and visible form of the combat within the body of the possessed. The combat is no longer between God and the devil. It is between the body underneath the category of flesh and the power of the spiritual director. Between the body and a new grid of religious language pressed into it. The convulsing nun is one of many scandalous resistant bodies that figure in Foucault's writing. My book tries to gather them. Foucault's unbroken longing to record the sounds of these bodies. He describes himself as crouching to hear them from beneath the earth, is always checked by his conviction that they occur at the very limit of language. At the unexpected end of his life, Foucault is still experimenting with how to render this bodily resistance. In History of Sexuality 2, he turns to bodily stylization as a category for describing resistance as reshaping. In Hermeneutic of the Subject, he is fascinated by the minute attention to the mundane body in ancient schools of philosophy. But even these later texts continue to register more extreme bodily possibilities, often linked to religion. the Roman Christian Fabiola's enactment of repentance recalls for Foucault an alternative Christianity, a bodily theater that churches mostly left behind in the cultivation of knowledge rather than art, of scientific speech rather than transforming tears. A reader looking for religion in Foucault can turn, of course, to his explicit treatments of Christianity. They recur frequently from the beginning to the end of his writing, more frequently in the final years. These passages are worth reading, and I do my best to recover their provocative claims about religious power. But Foucault's deepest engagement with religion occurs elsewhere. In his repeated imagination or imitation of resistant bodies that elude speech while exciting it. I am drawn to Foucault's repeated contacts with religion and especially with Christianity. These contacts are a central part of my attraction to his writing, of my fandom, as I confess it. But I have no plans to claim Foucault for religion, much less for Christianity, whatever exactly it means to talk without specification of religion or even Christianity. For me, there is no formulable essence of religion, no clear way of separating its words from the rest of human speech. The claim that religion can be neatly bounded is a corollary of atheism, while the denial of God's existence can be the highest pitch of theology. Nor am I satisfied with simple judgments about who belongs inside Christianity and who does not. According to old versions of Christianity, such judgments are impossible for human beings, and pretending to them is sinful. So I don't mean to rebaptize Foucault. We have no reason to doubt the validity of his original baptism. As a devoted reader of his texts, I insist only that other readers not skip over what he writes about gods and their devotees. At the same time, I want to show that readers underestimate the importance of religious topics when they look only for what Foucault says about religion. Religion is not a category that Foucault relies on for his most important writing. He often just assumes its usual meanings. He neither gives it a fixed essence nor uses it with a single valuation. Foucault's writing supposes rather that religion arises from and issues in fields of force inseparable from the rest of human history. What distinguishes it is not some rigid connection with an already separate realm of special entities. Religion is distinguished instead by how it arranges languages and practices, teachings and rituals to control this world and the body very much in it. Foucault is interested in the particular arrangements and the practices, not in the generalizing category. What most interests me is that religious speeches and rituals have in him an unusual intimacy with bodily speech, speeches about bodies, speeches uttered by bodies. When he approaches the trembling boundary at which speech enters into skin or issues from it, he often reverts to religious terms or examples, to ritual analogies or instances. He does so especially when there is a question of what cannot be spoken by or about bodies. Religion in Foucault tries to regulate how bodies cry out. That sound, that cry, Foucault wants above all to hear that sound in the moment when it refuses to become speech. So do I. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we have three wonderful respondents, discussants, to open the book for us, and then we will be able to open it for a general conversation. So I will introduce them in a certain order, but I have actually no idea if they'll speak in that order. I think you'll have to fight for the podium, whichever one wants to go first. Amy Hollywood is the Elizabeth H. Monrad Professor of Christian Studies here at the university. She is a popular teacher and well-known author and lecturer. And just a couple of items from her very extensive CV. The Soul as Virgin Wife, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Marguerite Porret, and Meister Eckhart in 1995. And in 2002, Sensible Ecstasy, Mysticism, Sexual Difference, and the Demands of History. She has forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Is it still forthcoming, or is it? Okay. Acute Melancholia and Other Essays. She is also the co-editor with Patricia Beckman of the very impressive Cambridge Companion to Christian Mysticism in 2012, and is currently exploring in her own continuing research the place of the mystical, often redescribed as enthusiasm, within modern philosophy, theology, and poetry. Mayra Rivera is the Associate Professor of Theology and Latino Studies, also here at the university. She joined the Divinity School very recently, although it's now 5 years, in 2010. Her wide-ranging work is transdisciplinary, engaging in critical theological studies, engaging key Christian themes in relation to current theory and philosophy. Her work also analyzes the role of religious ideas in Latina theory. Her 2007 book was The Touch of Transcendence, A Post-Colonial Theology of God, which explored the relationship between models of divine otherness and ideas about interhuman difference. She's also the co-editor with Stephen Moore of Planetary Loves, Spivak Postcoloniality and Theology in 2010, and the earlier co-edited book with Catherine Keller and Michael Nausner, Postcolonial Theologies, Divinity, and Empire. And she is currently finishing, or has finished, a book that explores the connections between theological and philosophical metaphors of body and flesh. And finally, coming from across the river, Professor James Bernauer from Boston College has been at BC since 1980, has also taught widely at other universities, including Loyola University in Chicago and Santa Clara University, and since 2008 has been the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at BC. His fields of interest include Holocaust studies, the philosophies of Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt, and fascism. And just to, again, just pick off a few of his many publications. In 2006, he wrote an essay called Philosophizing After the Holocaust that appeared in the volume Jesuit Postmodern. In 2007, A Catholic Conversation with Hannah Arendt, Friends on the Way. This was in the volume Friends on the Way, Jesuit Encounter with Contemporary Judaism. Forthcoming in Substances of Things Hoped For is the essay From European Anti-Jesuitism to German Anti-Jewishness, A Tale of Two Texts. And also forthcoming in a volume on Michel Foucault, Secular Self-Sacrifice on Michel Foucault's courses at the Collège de France. So we have three very learned discussants whose own work could fill a wonderful session here and probably will not too far in the future. And so I read them out in terms of Hollywood, Rivera, Bernauer, and unless anyone disputes, we might as well start with Amy.
I was trusting alphabetical order to save me, but no. Okay. Thanks, Frank, so much for hosting these events in general and this one in particular, and all of you guys for being here, and to Mark for writing what is a beautiful book, not only in cover design, but which it is, but also in its contents and in its mode of reading and of writing. I have read some different versions of this, and I find myself perhaps uncertain at moments whether I'm discussing and thinking about things that are actually in this version or that are in earlier versions. And so excuse me, Mark, if I sometimes lapse across different palimpsests of the text. I'm just going to say a couple general things, and then I want to raise two questions very, very briefly. I don't want to take up a lot of time here. Convulsing Bodies, Religion and Resistance in Foucault. It's also a great title. Here, Mark, Jordan, I don't have it in formal speak. Okay, Mark engages in a reading of Central, or MJ, as we all call you, actually, behind your back, little do you know. It's like, who said that to you? MJ, okay, yeah. Mark engages in a reading of central texts by Foucault, a set of readings held together by his conviction that Foucault is best read as a writer, one who attended with great care and precision to the various rhetorical forms he deploys across his corpus, from the published texts that were published as texts to the lectures of the Collège de France, to other more occasional forms, essays he wrote for Critique, a journal founded by Georges Bataille after the war, in which Foucault wrote some of his earliest, most important essays, and other forms beyond that. Taking his cue from Foucault's early essays on Georges Bataille, Pierre Klossowski, and Maurice Blanchot, I think all of them appeared in Critique, at least two of them did. Mark argues convincingly, I think, for the centrality of writing as a form of practice in Foucault's work. I think that's beyond question. He demonstrates that attention to style and stylistics was not a late addition to Foucault's analytic arsenal, easily recognizable in the lectures that Foucault gave at the Collège de France, but instead are central to Foucault from very early on in his career. Rather than being a mere issue of ornament, style is instead the very way that we inhabit the ethical. Foucault makes this clear in the famous preface to The History of Sexuality, Volume 2, where he makes the threefold distinction between ethics as a code, ethics as actual behavior, and ethics as, quote, the manner in which one ought to constitute oneself as a moral subject acting with reference to the prescriptive elements of that code, end quote. Here, Foucault himself articulates the centrality of style or stylistics to the ethical life itself. And one of the great achievements, I think, of Mark's book, if I'm reading it correctly, is to show the way that stylistics as central to the ethical life was there from the beginning, that it's there in the essays on Bataille and Blanchot and Klossowski, and that the choice of those authors in of itself points to this centrality of writing and of the sacred in some form, however we understand the sacred, and of stylistics to Foucault's work. So Foucault does not move from an analysis of power to a preoccupation with style, as some of his critics insist, and hold that pause because I'm going to come back to that kind of phrasing in a minute. Instead, Foucault's analytics of power is always also about style, or perhaps better, one of the key ways in which power speaks, power is enacted, power resists, is through stylization. Throughout the book, Mark is concerned with those places in which Foucault resists the articulable. We just heard him speak very eloquently to that. He suggests throughout the book that these are the moments when the body crying just on the edge of articulability are the moments at which stylistics is most crucial. And that's an interesting claim, and it's not a self-evident one, that the moment of inarticulability, the moment of pure cry, of silent whimpers, or of almost silent whimpers, that those are moments at which stylistics is most important. But that's the claim that Mark makes about Foucault, if I understand correctly, and I think that's also a claim I would make about Mark's own writing and what he's trying to put forward in Convulsive Bodies as well as in other works. In doing so, and this is the part that I can't quite figure out if it's fully in this book or not, in Convulsive Bodies, I say, but I'm not sure, in some versions of it, you appeal, it's not in the index, interestingly, and so I was going back and trying to read, and I was like, wait a minute, is it here? So I don't know if it's here, you can tell me, where you compare something like this inarticulate scream to the traditions of apophatic theology, suggesting a parallel between Foucault's writing and his writing on the edge of speech, and that of those within the Greek philosophical and the Christian theological traditions, and elsewhere one could argue, but that's what you're focused on, who engage in the processes of saying and unsaying that go under the name often go in the name of apophasis. It's really cataphasis and apophasis coming together in that moment, but that's all included. At the same time, Mark is insistent on the centrality, as we've already said, Mark has said and I've said, of bodies for Foucault, resistant, convulsive, often barely articulate bodies. He shows their presence throughout Foucault's writing, from History of Madness through the essays on Bataille, Klossowski, and Blanchot, to Discipline and Punish, the various volumes of the history of sexuality, and a number of the lecture courses, Abnormals chief among them. For Mark, then, questions of writing, style, bodies, and something like the unsaying associated with the sacred come together. It's through the stylization of bodies and writing, Mark suggests, that the unspoken emerges throughout Foucault's corpus. Always attuned to the different genres of Foucault's texts, Mark writes with a care and attention to their details unrivaled, I think, in the scholarship on Foucault. He does not read Foucault, and this is one of my favorite lines, it's empowering for me. He does not read Foucault in search of a theory, but instead follows Foucault in the articulation of an analytics of power, of reading, of style, of the sacred, vital to the proper understanding of Foucault's project, but also vital to the enactment of our own projects, right? So this is how Foucault becomes not a theory who constrains us, a theorist who constrains us in what we can do, but a person who gives us tools and analytics for producing our own work. Now, to claim the sacred here may, of course, be one of the more controversial of Jordan's claims. And yet, I think in what we just heard and in the book as a whole, Mark writes really convincingly about the way that what we might want to call, if we want to use this word, religious impulses, and the resistance to these very impulses runs throughout Foucault's text, and often precisely in those places where we might not be inclined to understand them as religious, right? The convulsive bodies of the nuns at Loudun, for example. All right, so that by way of a quick setup, there's two stylistic issues in the book that I want to ask about, and I'm going to be pretty brief about this. The first is what I would refer to as the use of something like prosopopeia. Okay, I think about the debates about Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Karen can help me here. I'm going to turn to the Bible people. I was like, I know he wrote a bunch of letters. No, but in the debates about 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there's this attempt to reconstruct all the various prosopopeia, the figures that pop up in Paul's letters. You know, my accusers say to me, or you say this. And Margaret Mitchell, who is a former colleague of mine and friend of mine at Chicago, you know, has written a series of very detailed arguments in which she's reconstructing what was going on in her mind at Corinth at various times based on these pop-up figures who object to Paul's teachings and that Paul has to shoot down. I imagine an audience 200 years from now, 2000. I don't have that much faith in the species, but let's give us 200. Performing a Pauline exegesis of this book, like small Margaret Mitchells. Margie's kind of short. Trying to figure out, and this is all taped, right? Trying to figure out who these audiences are, who these readers are, who are reading History of Sexuality, Volume 1, non-ironically, or who are assuming that we easily move and congratulatorily move from the torturous opening of Discipline and Punish to relief at the end of the physical tearing apart of a king killer's body. So there's various moments in the book in which Mark points to sometimes you point to yourself as a reader. So it's very clear you're referring to yourself as an earlier reader. Other times, I'm not sure who these readers are. And I can imagine, again, a kind of act of historical reconstruction. I'm kind of engaged in it myself, where I'm like, I wonder who he's talking about here. You know, are these students? Are these particular scholars that, out of politeness, he's not saying their names? Is it a mode of misreading to which he finds himself tempted, or is it a rhetorical way to make the point you want to make about the strength of Foucault's argument? So I have various points in the text, and it's often around political and moral issues, not always, but often, that this emerges, this kind of phantom reader or readers who are not quite doing it the right way. And I think you're right. I agree with all your readings, and yet I wonder about that rhetorical strategy and what's at stake in it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is a long, and like I said, this might not even be in this book, but this is a long-standing issue that I still can't figure out, and that is what the relationship is, if any, between irony and apophasis. So on the one hand, Mark points to in the beginning of the wonderfully named Chatting Genitals. I turned to that immediately, of course, Frank. This is Mark. A common mistake in reading, funny or fatal, is to take an ironic passage for a literal one. The mistake can arise from faulty writing, but more often from faulty reading. A reader misses cues by reading too quickly, or ignores them in wanting the text to deliver something it never meant to give. Readers who demand certainties will ignore a text's ironic disclaimers. Readers who require that a text deliver a specific brand of knowledge, a science, a theory, will hold the text down until it changes into what they seek. And then the argument is that this is something that happens in the reading of Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, when it appeared in English in '78, and got picked up by various kinds of political projects that Mark argues are at odds with the ironizing of identity politics that is central to the book as a whole. Totally agree with that, 100%. And yet I wonder how whether that kind of irony, which is a distancing technique in which one tells a story about exactly the kind of person you want to make fun of, right? So the Victorian hypothesis, I will tell this story about a Victorian view of sex and the liberation of sex from Victorian repression. I will tell a story as if I am, help me with names, Marxist, Marcuse, who I think is the great antagonist of the book. I'm going to write a book as if I am Marcuse, suggesting that now we have liberated sex just as we have and soon we will liberate ourselves from the capitalistic structures and all this will fall. And he actually makes that explicit link between sex and capitalism in History of Sexuality, Volume 1. So he performs Marcuse totally straight, then to flip it and say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Is that kind of irony, which is a distancing mechanism, is that related to, or is it not, to the kind of unsaying that we associate with apophasis, to the kind of, God is great, but God is not great because greatness in God is something that I cannot conceive of, and that all the limitations of any notion of greatness I have to be undone. They both involve a kind of unsaying, and yet one seems to me to be premised upon distance, and the other on a very tight, close proximity to the entity with whom one stands in relation, and to which one wants to understand, and whom one wants to understand. Excuse me, I'm not articulating that very well. There's other places I could point to. Mark points to the opening of Discipline and Punishment and the gruesome scene of the disembodying of the tortured victim, and then doesn't cite it and says, I'm squeamish, I don't want to cite this, but I'm expected to be happy as we move from that squeamish scene to the incarceral state. But of course, then you're going to find out, no, I'm not supposed to be happy because Foucault undoes that. And yet I wonder if the moment that's closest to the apophatic is precisely the convulsive ripped up body of the tyrannicide. And so therefore, if in your own deployment of irony, which is brilliantly done, you don't give up certain of the apophatic moments that are that Foucault makes available to us, let's put it that way. And so the question is, how much do you have to tear the body apart, to put it in the most gruesome terms possibly, imagistically, if not literally, in order to get to apophasis through embodiment, right? As opposed to apophasis as something that takes us away from embodiment, which is how it operates in Plotinus and others. It's something that makes me nervous. It's something that makes me very nervous about Bataille, whom I adore, but who spent his life meditating on victims of a sliced apart torture victim, right? For Bataille, it was very important that was an imaginary event, but it wasn't. It happened. They were photographs, and that interplay between the body at the edges of speech in torture and torment, as well as in ecstasy in different occasions, and its proximity to the apophatic is something that, for me, raises a host of ethical questions that I have not yet been able to resolve. And I think you use irony to distance, and I'm not sure if it's the same thing, if it's getting at the same thing. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you all for being here and for this opportunity to respond to a wonderful text that has had me think a bit too much, I think. So you'll see. Uh, Convulsing Bodies deserves many attentive readings. It explores Foucault's reading and writing, following the threads that weave his texts. By reading and writing attentively and lovingly, Jordan is also suggesting to us ways to read and write. Jordan's analysis stay close to Foucault's language, images, and examples. Indeed, he insists that some of the lessons are lost or even betrayed if we lose sight of this specificity. Jordan reads Foucault, but the name attached to my own reading is Jordan, not Foucault. I treat Foucault as a character in Jordan's story, a complex and intriguing story of desire to reach toward bodies and thus toward divinity, appearing fleetingly in their midst. The main character is Foucault. The plot is driven by the appearances of convulsing bodies. Readers and writers are caught in the cries of these convulsing bodies. Michel Desserteau, Foucault, Jordan. This story is not one to be summarized, but as Jordan suggests, I attend to the transient effects that the text evokes. I listen to the cries that reverberate through its pages. But as I hear the cries, my mind wanders off the page. Before I get to the cry, and before I wander off, let me rush through the problem of presenting bodies with which Jordan wrestles. Two examples of exclusion, silencing, and betrayal stand out as cautionary tales, as reminders as well of what threatens our own practices of speaking and writing. The first is capturing bodies by talking about them. The second is capturing bodies by compelling them to talk about themselves, to write themselves into given scripts. The first of these, the categorizations of bodies, produce all-encompassing maps in which to place bodies and make sense of them. Bodies are distributed in rationalized space, Jordan explains. This requires a whole system of lines in order to capture everyone, each one, within a little square. These systems override bodily peculiarity as measurable and controllable instantiation. The examples Foucault gives for such processes of division and indexing are those that take place within European territory, creating divisions between reason and madness, citizens and delinquents, and so on. And yet the descriptions evoke for me another dimension, the underside of modernity, as Enrique Dussel calls it. For the categories as well as the urge to organize bodies were entangled with colonial projects. Biopower developed and used some of its cruelest and most effective devices on the bodies of colonized and enslaved peoples. And those bodies served as clear examples of what was to be avoided, the fate of bodies deprived of the structures of rationality and reform, deprived from Christianity and European cultures. colonized and enslaved bodies have served as figures of the outer edges of humanity. The intellectual and aesthetic elements of that unrepresented past haunt the present. The second example of the control of bodies by speech is the demand placed on subjects to talk about themselves. Christian confession is an example of what would become a pervasive demand. We find the convulsing body disrupting these demands to speak, frustrating efforts to control bodies. The first and exemplar convulsing bodies are those of nuns whose bodies have become the battleground in the theater of possession. And I'll cite Jordan here. When the new ecclesiastical technology for controlling souls pushes too far, it encounters first the disordered speech of possession and then the cry of convulsion. The official demand for endless speech is contradicted by a dramatic interruption, a somatic refusal of the script. Later in the book, we encounter other convulsing bodies. We hear other cries, Fabiola's penance and Carusa's cry against the God who violated her. Each of them appears in a particular scene under specific forms of power. Each of them interrupts the narrative in a singular way. All of them point to a kind of limit. The convulsing body refuses speech in order to express itself somatically and symbolically, Jordan suggests. They are all women, Jordan notes. And this is not surprising, given how often women are figured as nothing but flesh. But rather than dismissing the attention to their cries as reasserting that particular role, Jordan argues that we can try to sense what the scenes convey. And I agree. And indeed, the writings about such cries with which I am most familiar are those of men and women of the Caribbean. I mentioned before that the technologies for controlling the living have been exercised intensely on the bodies of the colonized and the enslaved. And it is to those territories that my mind wandered when listening to the cries through the pages of Jordan's book. So let me invoke another witness to these cries. Edouard Glissant, a writer from Martinique, a French territory, links his poetics and his philosophy to the violations of colonialism. He wants history to acknowledge the devastation that became the birth of the Caribbean peoples, to tell the truth. Genres of writing that depend on tracing a lineage prove inadequate to this task, not least because this writing starts in the abyss of the slave ship, before which no linear narrative is possible. Before those enormous expanses of silence, my history became lost, Glissant writes. The languages, the communities, the ancestors, the gods are lost. Writing must start there, with the unspeakable, with that cry. At times, the writer's words are not offered to those who delight in them, are elated by them, Glissant notes, but to bodies burned by time. What then is language? This cry I elected, not only the cry, but absence beating in the cry, Glissant writes. But there is more. Jordan suggests that we turn to bodily forms of resistance to find possibilities for different paths, alternative lives, perhaps a different Christianity. Bodily resistance that is the trace or anticipation of another regime of bodies and pleasures. Jordan's words. What languages are available that will not betray or silence these bodies? And how does this relate to the political and to philosophy? To address these questions, Jordan leads us to encounter again Creusa's cry against the God who violated her. We are asked to attend to her cry of pain, tears, groans, and angry chant as elements of an organized cry, a ritual cry, the cry of complaint, the cry of recrimination. This woman performs her agony somatically, but through it she finds speech. This is not a therapeutic speech. The main argument in this section of the book is that the cry holds the possibility for social transformation, for democracy, and for philosophy. Jordan holds on to that possibility. He writes, human societies do sometimes recognize the cry of the weak against the strong. They recognize it as indispensable invocation for another kind of speech, for the more confident citizen speech of frank declaration. Philosophy is the daughter of political truth-telling. The capacities for writing these are quite different from those of the scientific categorizations to which Jordan refers at the beginning of the book. Jordan's own voice is quite different too, as he observes that a loss of the capacity to write suffering is a loss in representing human bodies. Reading this book this time around evoked not only the cries of those lost in the colonial past, but also in more recent history, indeed in the vanishing present. On December 7th, when leaving Memorial Church, I walked into Harvard students dramatizing their own death. I realized it is one thing to participate in a die-in, to lie down with others, and quite another to walk through their piled bodies, to look at them from above, to have their bodies make demands on you. Without a word. I had to walk carefully. Better not to step on a hand or a foot. Better not trip and make a spectacle of myself. Which meant I had to look at them intently. Their protest was a dramatization. And it was true. A truthful representation of our own society. These are not convulsing bodies. The bodies lying on the steps of the church are not the bodies of those who have received the deadliest end of state power. Those bodies are absent. Many of the students know that their bodies are overwritten by power, that they are targets for ongoing surveillance and security. Others were just outraged and considered laying down their bodies as the most appropriate response, perhaps refusing to speak themselves into assigned identities and roles, pointing only to life. They bring us back to bodies in order to convey the resistance to power as violence that destroys black and brown bodies. The social movement does not lack words. It has moved beyond the cry. Corporeal expressions are accompanied by historical narrative and demands for truth-telling. But the conjunction of somatic dramatization and political speech points us back to the cries of death, those we never heard. Let me cite Glissant again. And it is to this absence, this silence, and this involution that I bind in my throat my language, which thus begins with a lack. And my language, rigid and dark, or alive or strained, is that lack first. Then the will to slow the cry into speech before the sea. Jordan wants us to hear and register the cries, even as he acknowledges that they occur at the limit of language. They resound in the places of the poetic. They resound in the spaces of the holy. Thank you.
It's very nice to be with you here. I want to thank Mark and Frank for the invitation to come over and to speak on Mark's book. I've been a fan of Mark for a long time, and I've recommended his writings to many people over the years, perhaps even more than I've recommended Foucault. I have a story, a true story to begin. A number of years ago, I was flying back to Boston from, I forgot whether it was Chicago or California, but I got chatting with the person next to me, who was a young man, mid-20s, mid to late 20s. And usually I don't like to talk on the phone, on the plane. But he was engaging. And it wasn't you, was it?
It was me. We'll talk later.
You're kidding me.
No, I was going to tell you later, but
You're not, you're serious.
No, I'm dead serious, yeah.
He is engaging.
Okay. Well, now, I haven't talked to many on the plane, but so maybe you are the one. Are you the one who turned to me and said, actually, we were chatting, and you were speaking about your life. And as we were coming into Boston, you asked me, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? And I said, sure. And you said, are you a religious man? Okay. I did not expect this. This was not planned. And he said, are you a religious man? And I said, well, why do you ask? And my presumption was that he had caught my pastoral sensibility. And I even did a quarter of CPE. And he said that, well, the reason I asked is you're reading a book about a saint. And I put in the pocket in front of me David Halperin's Saint Foucault. Is this the accurate? Well, anyway, I did not realize that your cover has won a prize, because I thought this would be a nice transition. The Convulsing Bodies, now you've put me really on the spot. The Convulsing Bodies in the title on Mark's cover seems a repudiation of any stable sanctity. Its staccato face is a visual affront to the technologies that smoothly anchor us to an identity. The dissonance of the letters also reflects the style of Mark's composition and of his project. This is his own appropriation of some of Foucault's writings, a record of the reading of those texts. As he informs us, this is his Foucault reading diary, a project that grew from his teaching of classes on Foucault. At the same time, Mark's reading diary is not drawn to Foucault's bodily life, and he proudly confesses that he only skimmed the biographies of Foucault, examined some photographs, heard or watched a few recordings. This avoidance of biographical interest aims to skirt the registering of a life that is but the shorthand of power. This strategy certainly yields benefits, as many of Marx's acute observations on Foucault makes abundantly clear. And his approach seems to be faithful to some of Foucault's most distinctive comments. In his inaugural lecture, he spoke of his desire for anonymity. I would really like to have slipped imperceptibly into this lecture, as into all the others I shall be delivering, perhaps over the years ahead. At the moment of speaking, I would like to have perceived a nameless voice, long preceding me, leaving me merely to enmesh myself in it, taking up its cadence and to lodge myself when no one was looking in its gaps, as if it had paused an instant in suspense to beckon to me. Most of us who read Foucault are probably very familiar with this search of anonymity, for it found such striking expressions. I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face, a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. In 1964, he compared the writer to the martyr. Writing is now linked to sacrifice and to the sacrifice of life itself. It is a voluntary obliteration of the self, and so on. But perhaps there's a paradox here. Foucault's anonymity seems to possess the power to solicit eager personal response. Marx's project of a reading diary reflects a very broad field of personal reaction and connection to Foucault's writing. While Marx cites Henry James's Death of a Lion as an indication of what unfortunately might characterize an individual's relation to an esteemed author, I found myself recalling with pleasure the very different experience in Patricia Drucker's novel, Hallucinating Foucault, in which the narrator celebrates the intimacy of reading a writer who is taken as articulating his writings explicitly for that reader himself. However, there's no need of fiction for this personal witness. As was the case for many others, I was startled by the profoundly personal opening meditation in the Liddell McWhorter's Bodies and Pleasure, in which she recounts her struggle with same-sex desire. Quote, I didn't want to die, I just couldn't see any honorable way to live. I was mostly dead already. And then she tells us that on January 7th, 1983, she read the first volume of Foucault's History of Sexuality and discovered a gay point of view that did not lead to objectification. Quote, I was astonished, I was excited, I was overjoyed. Never have I been so happy with a book between my hands. End of quotation. Yet another personal testimony is from a former prisoner who opens his review of a Foucault biography with this confession. It was while doing time in a Massachusetts prison that I became acquainted with the work of Michel Foucault. I recognized that my past brutality and violence had necessitated some form of intervention, but also intuitively knew the prison taught it rather than promoted the possibility of change. The regime of social relations that the prison authorized was structured to reinforce a deviant status and perpetuate deviance itself. Discipline and punish was a powerful articulation of the contradictions of confinement that I and other prisoners experienced daily, but had no language to express. Because Foucault spoke to the heart of my existence, I avidly sought out his other works. End of quotation. Isn't this the Foucault who was an engaged thinker, the co-founder of an advocacy group for prisoners? So I feel a tension on this issue of the personal in Foucault, and I want to pose a question to Mark. Why does your diary of reading not have more of an interest in Foucault's personal power as a feature of his work? Well, I do not want to ignore the task you set for yourself, and I appreciate your modesty regarding its particular interest. Why did that task seem so inviting to you? But doesn't it lead to some loss, namely a possible depersonalization of Foucault as a thinker, as an historically significant, engaged cultural agent? Although he certainly stressed anonymity and was allergic to biographical celebrity, why do you seem not to be influenced by other remarks which he made, such as this? In a sense, this is to quote Foucault, in a sense, I have always wanted my books to be fragments from an autobiography. And later he claimed, each of my works is part of my own biography. I myself believe that Foucault's thought and writing took a significant shift in his last 5 years, when he was studying paresia, one's personal relationship to truth, when he was writing about aesthetics of existence, as well as a culture of care for the self. Perhaps Nehemias is correct in claiming that Foucault came to a fresh insight in his last years, namely that his private project was of public significance. And is it conceivable that he came to realize that the source of his desire for anonymity, which had so attracted him earlier, was not his personal resolve, but rather part of that same cultural matrix that had imposed facelessness, if not worse, on those millions of human beings who had been reduced in our age to anonymous masses? My second question concerns an absence in Mark's text, one that stands out for me at least, in a book with the subtitle Religion and Resistance in Foucault. Would it be accurate to say that your focus has been on individual resistance and not on the collective resistance that is at the center, for example, of Foucault's treatment of the Iranian Revolution? As was the case with most other observers of the rapidly changing situation in revolutionary Iran, Foucault made misjudgments about the likely future course of the revolution. Khomeini did become the hero of the Iranian people, but contrary to Foucault's expectation, he did not withdraw from the political scene, and Iran has had to live with the consequences of that refusal ever since. Still, when the situation evolved from the violence of the Shah to the violence of the Ayatollah, Foucault protested several times. For example, he wrote in Le Monde as his reply to his critics at the time, "It is certainly not shameful to change one's opinion, but there's no reason to say that one's opinion has changed when one is against hands being chopped off today after having been against the tortures of the Savak yesterday." As Hannah Arendt had done in reaction to the so-called failure of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, Foucault saluted the courage of the tens of thousands who risked their lives in the hope of a better post-Shah life. As he wrote, quote, "The spirituality of those who were going to their deaths has no similarity whatsoever with the bloody government of a fundamentalist clergy," end of quotation. As certainly turned out to be the case with the Hungarian uprising and its influence in Eastern Europe up until 1989, the final word about the efficacy of that Iranian spirituality and revolution has not yet been spoken. Despite the limitations of some of his treatment of the Iranian Revolution, he was well ahead of his time when he wrote in 1978 that the problem of Islam as a political force is an essential one for our time and the coming years. And it would seem to me that his consideration of the revolution would be consistent, indeed important, for some of the strengths that you see in his work, Mark. Foucault said this in an interview, quote, "People always quote Marx in The Opium of the People. The sentence that immediately preceded that statement, and which is never quoted, says that religion is the spirit of a world without spirit. Let's say then that Islam in that year of 1978 was not the opium of the people precisely because it was the spirit of a world without a spirit," end of quotation. Some critics have accused Foucault of a fundamental limitation, namely his dependence on a post-structuralist leftist discourse, which opened the door to an uncritical stance because it had spent all of its energy opposing the secular, liberal, or authoritarian modern state. Contrary to that position, wasn't Foucault's openness to the religious dynamics of the Islamic world due to eminently personal experiences? Let us recall that Foucault spent a year, 1958 to 1959, in Poland, where he saw the Catholic Church's strong opposition to the communist government. Of course, Pope John Paul II, who became Pope a month before Foucault's first trip to Iran, and about whom he was fascinated, brought that resistance to an extraordinary efficacy, as was shown in the massive outpouring of popular support for him during his trip to Poland in the spring of 1979. That visit was the catalyst for the Solidarity movement, of which Foucault became a strong public supporter, and arguably was one of the major events that announced the coming collapse of communism. However, perhaps even more important for understanding Foucault's sense of the religious dynamic were his visits to Brazil in the early and mid-1970s while the military dictatorship was in control. He would have been very alert to the theologies of liberation that had come to prominence in South America at that time, even if suspicious of any Marxist dimensions to them. He would have seen the Catholic Church's militant advocacy of human rights and the type of power it was capable of exercising. To give one example, in 1975, a prominent Jewish journalist, Vladimir Herzog, was killed while in police custody, another event that intimidated the Jewish community there. The Archbishop of Sao Paulo decided to organize an interdenominational memorial service for the murdered journalist, and this is Foucault's impression of the event. Quote, "The service drew thousands and thousands of people into the church, onto the square, and so on, and the cardinal in red robes presided over the ceremony, and he came forward at the end of the ceremony in front of the faithful, and he greeted them shouting, 'Shalom, shalom.' And there was all around the square armed police, and there were plainclothes policemen in the church. The police pulled back. There was nothing the police could do against that. I have to say that had a grandeur of strength. There was a gigantic historical weight there." End of quotation. It was the spiritual political power of that historical weight that I believe prepared Foucault for Iran and generated some of his hope for his revolution. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Amy, Mayra, and Jim for wonderful substantive responses, and also for being relatively brief and timely. So we have time for discussion, and first a word from Mark. Would you like to comment first, say a few things?
I think I can say it in 120 seconds.
All right, come, I'll be watching here.
No, I don't. I only want to pick out a couple of things, just to indicate points of agreement, because I would much rather this evening be offered as a quartet rather than a single voice with respondents. I would rather make this an oblation of speech to Foucault. On the question of irony, yes, Amy, we should talk more about that. I suspect it goes back to my reading of the symposium and to the kind of incarnate irony that Socrates is, precisely as a mystagogue. Charlie Stang has tried to teach me the correct reading of Pseudo-Dionysus, but I have been a very bad student. And so for me, the Socratic irony is what I think of as incarnate irony, which is performed and described in the symposium, is very much carried forward into the Dionysian tradition, and indeed amplified because you're dealing with an incarnate God, by which I don't mean Socrates. Yeah. On Jim's point, yes and amen, but part of what I want to say is that the books are fragments of the autobiography. This is the only way you can write autobiography in an age of biopower, that is, through a mask of anonymity. If I'm not mistaken, the description of the Cardinal's political speech, it's from the interviews with Thierry Volzel, right? Okay, because I know Foucault also talks about it there, where he says he's the last person in France who's still interested in the Catholic Church. And he goes on to describe the power of the church in these moments of political resistance. But what's, of course, fascinating about that is that Foucault insisted that those interviews be published without mentioning his name. So it seems to me very often in his relation to his own biographical data, there's a complicated performance of overwriting, anonymity, masking. So I do, in some sense, I do take the irony as the writing of the autobiography. With that, let me stop. Frank, do you want us up here to? I thought you were going to say pulling out Halpern's St. Foucault. Yes, I am a very pious man. Please, you all have listened with wonderful attention. So.
And there's so many copies of the book in the room, so you can point to page such and such.
And I can pretend that I remember what I wrote.
Yes, that's what this one is.
Someone start us off.
Can I? Thank you. Thank you for this. And what a beautiful read, apart from the fact intellectually and just sort of literary. My question to you is the fact that you talk about the notion of the secular and religion as two different concepts of the same paradigm. And within the book itself and for Foucault, under the notion of disciplinary, what he talks about in biopower, which I think currently is so timely in the age of post-colonialism and the way we're looking at surveillance, and the discourse between secularism and fundamentalism that he alludes to even in his work on the revolution, Rhine Revolution. I just wanted to know, sort of tease that out a little bit more, Mark.
Well, part of what I'm trying to do is to, I never understand what people mean by the secular. To me, the word either is a highly tendentious claim, which presupposes what it's trying to describe, asserts as fact, or it's just a very fuzzy term. And I'm willing to let it be very fuzzy, in the same way that in Foucault I'm willing to let the word religion be very fuzzy, because he uses the word, sometimes he's thinking of Bataille, and sometimes he's thinking of the newspaper, and sometimes he's thinking of the Catholic Church in France, and the word floats. But part of what I'm trying to do, especially in the introduction, is just to say, if you come looking for a theory in Foucault on religion, and that's what you want, you will have missed the main things Foucault has to say about the religious, because that's not his category for describing it. Where he is describing it is in these moments of somatic resistance at the edge of language. So in that sense, I think Foucault, when he uses words like secular or when he uses the religious, he's just using the most common, ordinary meaning, which is why we have to look elsewhere for what he's saying. Does that make sense?
When you talk about Socratic irony in particular, how does that differ from other kinds of irony? And does it have anything to do with the fact that when Socrates was employing like kind of an incarnate irony, does it have anything to do with the fact that he was employing it in response to a particular institutional crisis? And how does that work its way into thinking about it when it comes to using irony as kind of a practice to kind of confront an institutional crisis when it comes to, for example, the Catholic Church? Does that make sense?
Let me say part of it, and then, so part of what I meant by saying that was just, I take the high point of the symposium not to be Socrates' evidently fictitious report of a conversation with Diotima, right? In which he gives a recognizably Platonic doctrine of ascent from bodies to the pure beauty. I take the crowning point of the symposium to be Alcibiades' drunken speech about what didn't happen on the couch with Socrates that night. Which, by the way, I think Alcibiades is also lying, right? But that's another thing. So I just want to carry that forward, because it seems to me that in Alcibiades' speech, when he uses the image of the little figures of the gods for sale in the marketplace, right? They're very ugly on the outside. They're the figure of Marsyas, for example, kind of monstrous figure like Socrates, old, snub-nosed. And on the inside, there are these luminous figures of the divine. You open up the little statue, ugly statue, and inside there's the figures of the divine. It seems to me that Foucault, and Foucault would deny this because he's very skeptical of the Platonic tradition, and especially of what it did, I think, in collaboration with Christianity. But there are these moments in Foucault which are Alcibiades moments. There's these moments of Foucault trying to find the latch to pull open the door that's going to reveal the luminous divine within ugly bodies. And of course his divine is different from the one Socrates is talking about, and the bodies are different, and so on and so on. But it's that notion of irony that I'm using. It's that notion of the improbable concealment, the kind of vanishing concealment of the divine within moments, often moments of horror, as Amy said. Yeah, I'm not. And I do definitely, I didn't mention Mayra's remarks in replying because I just so fully take on what she's saying. That is part of the problem when we go to Foucault and biopower. If we go to part 5 of History of Sexuality 1, that maddeningly abbreviated text, which is abbreviated in order to be offensive, leaves out what becomes completely clear in Foucault's lecture, which is the notion of biopower is inseparable from Foucault's understanding of racism. Right. So the bodies we're talking about, we constantly have to correct Foucault's particular instances of it.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, it's-
Good to see you. We're old friends.
Wait, was it Chicago or California?
I actually don't remember. It's in California. So a brief question. We heard you say that you don't want to claim Foucault for Christianity or religion, but I'm wondering if or how you want to claim me for theology.
Oh, that's not fair.
Yes, it is.
Amy, you have something profound to say about that.
That's not fair.
I can address it to both of you.
Yeah. What was the question? No. Yeah, you don't want to. Well, because you know what theology. Well, no, you answer the question. You have an answer. I know you have an answer.
Well, the answer I'm trying to write out now. So there's an obvious cross-reference in the title of my books on Foucault and Aquinas,
Right.
which I have been writing at the same time for the last several years. And the cross. Okay, so it would go something like this in the 122nd version. So in Thomas, there's still a confidence in the ability of human languages, including philosophical languages, to make clear why God would take flesh in order to teach enfleshed human beings. Right? That's like the fundamental confidence of the Summa. Right? And it's from that incarnation of God that Thomas reads out the pattern of human life. In Foucault, and I think Foucault is right about this, that confidence is obscene, right? Because of what's happened historically, what's happened culturally. So that Christian language, Christian scriptures, Christian institutions are now so soaked with innocent blood that you can't just speak with that old confidence, right? By the way, I could tell exactly. I think I could have, and maybe should have written a book on Certeau, because I think Certeau is absolutely clear about this, right? But what I'm saying is that this is what Foucault finds so attractive in Certeau's retelling of Loudun. Loudun, that story for Certeau is about how Christian discourses negotiate power transfers with the discourses of modern medicine, right? A very Foucauldian story. But what Foucault is struggling with in there is just this question. All right, if God has dead and the space of God has been filled by the discourses of biopower, what language is available for speaking about human lives?
I want to come back to something, but before I do, I just remembered where we met.
It's,
It was a plane from Europe. It was a plane from Europe.
London?
And it was, I had a book by Deserteau. And we had a that's what just jarred my memory. We had a conversation.
I was reading the Certeau.
You were reading Deserteau.
Yeah, I was reading the Certeau. Yeah, I was reading the Certeau. Yeah.
Well, as a Jesuit, I feel every Deserteau book belongs to me.
I think you might have said that too.
Yes, that was the conversation. I remember now. But that wasn't the conversation I mentioned at the
We also
beginning.
watched the movie, but
You guys really, like, yeah.
But one thing I wanted to just,
Okay, I
add to Mark's response to the question about secularity and religion. I think it's true that Foucault, is constantly shifting in his analysis of those categories. But in terms of being in France in 1978 when the Iranian Revolution broke out, he was really arguing against secular learning and its failure to understand the significance of these seemingly religious events in Iran. And he analyzed those, the marches, the religious encounters, the celebration of death, and the courage of the people. And he was mocking, and that's what, we actually had a dispute earlier, not today, but about this interview, The Masked Philosopher, which took place in 1980 in Paris. And I happened to be there. And Mark uses it, if you've read the book, he mentions The Masked Philosopher. And I felt we all knew who The Masked Philosopher was, people who were living in Paris at the time. But the point of it was he was trying to tell the academic world in Paris to look seriously at the issue of what was going on in Iran and not connected to Foucault as this eccentric thinker. So I think there is, I guess you have to, as you do in your book, you analyze it very carefully where Foucault is moving at this particular stage.
I want to hear about theology. Mayra, this is you too.
I think the one thing that's running through my head, and I don't know if I can make this articulate at this point, is that what you describe as the Socratic irony. I'm the opposite of what I appear to be, right? So the snub-nosed and open, and the beauty of what is concealed within moments of horror. I think I get that as Socratic irony. I'm not sure how much that plays into what's going, the way irony is being deployed in Foucault, is one thing. And the other thing, more importantly, I think, is that I don't get how you take that notion of Socratic irony into the Christian apophatic, mystical tradition, where I'm not going to speak on behalf of Dionysus. Leave that to Charlie. Because this is a question I really don't know about with Dionysus, because it's much debated and fought about. But I think with Bernard and Clairvaux, say, or Eckhart, say, it's not at all clear that they have place for the incarnation. They want to have a place for the incarnation. They know they're supposed to have a place for the incarnation. They say, oh, that's right, we're not really going to be happy till we get those bodies back. And yet, when they're talking about what the sort of heights of union are, it's a place in which bodies fall away. Precisely because, I don't know precisely because why, but one argument would be because the body would have to be so broken and so, eviscerated as to render it too horrible a sight for God to be. And that's arguably what happens with various forms of late medieval piety, where the emphasis is so intensely upon, the piece of flesh gouged out of Christ's hand by the wound, by the nail on the cross, and that's all about that intense viscerality as the site in which the most beautiful salvific thing has occurred. That's the stuff Bataille's fascinated with. I find irony, maybe it's just too much training in a certain, having grown up in the 80s, ironic mode of detachment, where I find it hard to call that irony. Precisely because there's a kind of detachment connoted by irony as I read it in a contemporary valence that feels very far removed from those intense questions of whether bodies suffer so much that we have to hope that there's a way to get away from them to the side of the truly beautiful, or whether bodies suffer so much that we have to go through the intensity of that suffering to come out the other end with the resurrected body. Whichever one of those paths you choose, both imply an immersion in what you take to be the really real, that feels very unironic to me. And maybe it's just because I'm misusing the word ironic.
I will give you Bernard.
Okay.
And I will give you Eckhart.
Okay.
I will not give you Bonaventure.
No, you can, I don't want Bonaventure. You can have Bonaventure. No, I don't want Bonaventure. Believe me. Yeah.
But it's in Bonaventure. It's at the end of the itinerarium, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you get what I think is this attempt to speak both the distance and the proximity. Or to say that more precisely, that the proximity of suffering flesh is so overpowering that you can only, as it were, speak it through a distance.
Right, and it's precisely that I think is actually right. And the thing, and what I am fascinated by is those moments. I mean, not that, I don't know why, but it's moments in the Christian tradition and in the Neoplatonic tradition where it's like, no, I won't keep that distance, right? And does that mean it's a foreclosure of the reality of that suffering, or is it actually the only way in which that suffering is truly apprehended? That would be Eckhart's accusation to Bonaventure if they were to be having a fight in this room right now, and which would be a much more interesting fight. But you do see what I'm saying? It's like, is the apprehension of the real, to use Bataille language, in your full immersion of an attempt to overcome all distance between oneself and the horror of the event, or is the event so horrible that you have to take a step back? And is that taking a step back the movement we want to call irony? So yeah, okay, that's helpful to sort out.
So I have a question about what you call your fanish relationship to Foucault. And so I guess I'm wondering about the viability of a set of analogies, and then I have a few follow-up questions. So I'm curious if...
Give it to me in small portions.
I'm very small portions. So I'm curious about whether you see, I guess, your fanaticism, perhaps, right, as a kind of religious devotion to Foucault, and if you might imagine that fanaticism itself might be a viable mode of religious devotion more generally, outside of one's relationship to a specific thinker. And then I have a question about genre. So going along these lines, if we imagine that fanaticism, fanishness are part of the ways that are structuring the way that you've written this text, do you imagine, could we think of your text as a kind of fan fiction? Right. So insofar as you do enact this devotion to Foucault, would you then also think about fan fiction itself as part of a genealogy of devotional literatures? Are there other modern genres that might be doing the same kind of devotional work for us? And I say us because I'm curious about the collaborative nature of fan fiction, and maybe this gets to Amy's question about whom these readers are. When you interpolate or address a fandom, who is a part of that community, and are you calling for something like reading as a collaborative effort in order to perform devotion?
So let me take them backwards. What Amy points to is a stylistic tick, which I learned from Thomas Aquinas, which is when Thomas is disagreeing with someone who's roughly his contemporary, he never names the person.
Right.
He always says, quidam dicun, some say.
Eckhart does the same thing, yeah.
And so that's my Thomistic tick. And it's partly a sense of respect. It's also partly, there's so much bad reading in academic life where, people seize on one error, ignoring 75 pages of its elaboration. So I just don't want to get into the question of the amount of time that would be required to establish that this vice actually exists in this text. So I use the medieval device of just personifying the vice, right?
Right.
There's another sense of this personification, which is giving voice to the dead. And that I'm doing throughout the book, obviously, right? So in that sense of prosopopeia, I'm that older sense. I'm from beginning to end, I'm doing that. The book is I regarded the book as a long love letter to Foucault, and that's why it ends with a meditation on his death, because it ends with a kind of explicit act of grieving. Though precisely in that ending, I want to say, don't imagine that we know what it is to describe a life or a death. So I deliberately intercut so-called nonfiction accounts of the death with fictional accounts of the death, precisely to acknowledge my investment, my creation of stories around Foucault out of a sense of love. The collaborative is more difficult. I need to think more about that. The writing of the book and writing for me in general is such dissociative, solitary work that I never think of myself as being as reading with others or reading or writing with others. But of course we do, as Frank said at the very beginning. And the questions in the book, the whole book itself comes out of a series of lectures that I read over in Sperry Hall. And even more from the question and answer period that followed each lecture in class. So in many of those pages, I'm deliberately I'm writing with the people who are present in that room. So thank you. But I have no words for that play of collaboration and solitary devotion. But I do have an image. As a boy, I grew up in Mexico next to one of the Marian shrines, one of the major Marian shrines. In fact, in my neighborhood, it was regarded as probably equal of the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, about which we had our doubts. But the Basilica of Our Lady of Zapopan outside of Guadalajara, I could watch from the house that I grew up in, people going on their knees up to the basilica across cobblestone streets, usually accompanied by their families. And I would often think of the sense of privacy and community at the same time. So these people going up as individuals, accompanied by their loved ones who are putting down mantillas in front of them so that their knees aren't so badly cut. But they're all going to the same place, and they're all going at the same time in the street. But each family unit, each person on the knees is like intensely solitary. That's writing about Foucault for me.
I think, although this could go on much longer, it's probably time at 7 to end the formal session. There's no reason for anyone to rush from the room. There are still things to eat and drink, and so please stay around. Please come back on 2 weeks from Thursday, Jocelyn Cesari's book, Awakening of Islamic Democracy, in the same room. I think it'll be a wonderful event also. You're most welcome. But let us conclude by thanking Mark and